Hi everyone, my name is Antonia, this is PerryPictures, and today we are doing a video tutorial on digital shading. So I'm going to go ahead and start with a couple of drawings that are already drawn so that we can focus specifically on shading them. I have on one side a character drawing that has flat colors, and then on the other side I have a scene or a background drawing that is using a lot of gradients, and we will talk about both as we go into the shading process. I am doing this tutorial in Autodesk Sketchbook, also known as Sketchbook Inc, but these techniques will work in any digital drawing software. So let's go ahead and get started. First thing I'm going to do, now that I have my drawing on the original layer, which you can see up here in the corner on my layers menu, is open a new layer. So create new layer, and I'm going to go ahead and change the blend mode of this layer from normal to multiply, which is actually right up here at the top. I scrolled past it, but now that I have a multiply layer on top of my regular drawing layer, I can go ahead and lower the opacity of this one. You don't have to, but I like to personally because I don't like to draw on my shadows a little too harsh at first. And then select a color for your shadows. I'm going to start with my knight over here, and I would like my shadows to be more of a cool tone since we have all this cool tone armor on him. So I'm going to go ahead and color drop that darker blue that is underneath his exterior layers. You can shade with black if you want to on a multiply layer. It works out nicely, and I've done it plenty of times, especially if I'm trying to draw something a little bit quicker. But if you have the time and if you want to try and experiment a little bit using some color variation, can give you some really interesting results. For my brush, I'm going to go ahead and use a hard brush. I'm not going to use like an airbrush. An airbrush would give me more of this airbrushy look, but I'm going to go with something a little bit less opaque and a little bit more hard edge. And now when I come over here to draw some shadows on top of my knight here, I will see them come in right under this armor. It's almost like cell shading. I'm going to layer these in anywhere I feel that the forms of the body are going to be casting a shadow away from our light source. And for the sake of this, I'm going to go ahead and presume that my light source is coming from the top left corner when we drop in these shadows. Let's put my light source up here. And going back to my multiply layer and my harder brush, I am going to continue with these, and I might speed up the footage just so that we can get to the next point and you'll still be able to see the results of this step that we talked about here. So I've put a lot of shadows here on the right side of the character's body because this is the side that is facing away from the light and would be in shadow, but you also want to consider the 3D form of the character or the character's clothing, armor, or accessories that might also cast a shadow. So for example, one of the areas where I am adding a drop shadow is here at the waist, just beneath the armor. Even on the left side of the character, well, right and left. Let's talk about right and left for a second here. So his left, my right, is facing away from the light source. I'm still adding a drop shadow on my left, his right, because anything that is on top of something else is going to catch that light, and whatever's underneath it is not going to get the light. Does that make sense? So the armor is obstructing the light from reaching this part of the pants just beneath it, which is why I put a drop shadow under the armor there. For the skin, I am choosing to use the same dark blue for adding in my shading, still on the same multiply layer, but you are able to change this up if you would like to. I'll go ahead and show an example of what it would be like to ink drop the skin tone itself and then come in here and lie shadows using that color. I am now getting a warmer shadow than what I was getting with the blue. If you look at the hand here, there is no right or wrong way to do it. You can use either one based on what you would like to do. It really just depends on how you're feeling and how much color variance you would like to see in your piece. And since I've done everything in this very hard line shape, I kind of like it and I wouldn't mind leaving it this way. But we'll go ahead and look at some ways to soften up these shadows as well. And one way to do that is to come here and grab a blur tool, and then we can come in here and soften some of these shadows, just like this. When it comes to shading with softer edges like this, I think a good rule of thumb is to do a balance of soft and hard edges, because if you blur everything, then your picture ends up looking kind of muddied and not as crisp, and you end up with a very blurred look all over that is not necessarily as attractive or appealing. So consider shape language when you're talking about one straight edge versus one curved edge, like with drawing, say, like the form for an arm or for the torso of the body, where you kind of want to have one straight edge like I have at his back here, and then one curved edge which I have here at the chest. If you look at the arm, you kind of have a straight edge here, but then the bicep bows out, it's curved. Things like that. With that kind of shape language, you might want to think the same terms for your hard and soft shadows. And then there's also to take into consideration the form of the thing that you're shading. So softening these shadows so that it blends out more and looks a little bit more gradient gives us a rounder form. And then if we look down here at the bottom edge where I've left that shadow a little bit sharper, we're looking at a flat plane. So when you're deciding what needs to be soft and what needs to be hard, looking at the object that you're shading is really, really useful. When coloring digital art, though, we're not really restricted to one layer. That's kind of the beauty of digital art, is you're able to work in layers, versus when you're working in traditional media, what you put on the page becomes a part of the picture. You have the option to experiment a little bit more with digital art, so we're able to come in here and create a new layer. We can also set this one to multiply, and this will be like a second pass of shadows. But if we end up not loving it, or we want to try our second pass again, or even adjust the opacity of that to be more or less prominent, we're able to do that with the new layer without making any changes to our first pass of shadows. So now, having added a second pass of shadows, we're seeing a lot more form, especially in the face and in some of the darker areas of the armor, depending on how they are facing away from the light source. But what really brings this home after you're finished with your shading first, second, even third or fourth passes is adding in your midtones and highlights, which I will jump to now. We'll tone them down a little bit though, so that we can focus on the shading, which we're going to move back into now as we talk about shading on top of gradients instead of flat layers, and how that can give you a whole new level of dimension. Luckily, this is not a how to draw backgrounds tutorial, and if it was, it would certainly be a how to draw simple backgrounds, and I digress. We're going to go ahead and talk about shadows. So let's go ahead and start again with a multiply layer. We're going to go ahead and set that layer to multiply, just like we did before. Lower the opacity. I lower the opacity so the colors from the other drawing and the line art from the other drawing can show through my multiply layer. And so when I go to lay some shadows onto this drawing, and we'll go ahead and do some of that now. Let's pick a color, and I will start by shading in this area right here, because all of this is hidden away from our light source. This is a recessed plane. There's this overhang here. The lights that is bouncing off of this roof and that is lighting this roof is not reaching this area inside here, and that is why this area inside here is in shadow. The same thing goes for this face of the building under here, beneath that area, and also recessed under these pillars. We can tell that this is a recessed area because the pillars are falling in front of it, and then of course the roof is hanging over it. We have this overhang here, so we will add this area into shadow as well. So let me go ahead and fill that in inside of this pillar that is facing the interior space of this recessed area. Is also going to have a little bit of shadow as well, but this is one of those forms again that it's one of those contoured shapes. It's a very round shape, so we're going to go ahead and soften that shadow a little bit to kind of follow the form of the object that we're shading. We actually have another wall that's on the same forward-facing plane. So I'm going to go ahead and this can be a little bit trickier because we have this tree here. So this entire wall here with the 3 windows is a forward-facing plane, and so is this rooftop here. And then on this tree, I'm actually going to soften, like I did the pillars, I'm going to soften the shadow on this tree. Because this tree is going to have, it's not the flat facing plane that the wall is. This tree has more of a contoured shape, so we're going to want to shade that differently. Now this wall with the door here is facing the same direction as this wall over here on the side of the building, but I'm coloring in the side of the building wall, but I'm not coloring in the door wall, and the reason being we see this green roof is overhanging that wall there at the very edge of the composition, so that is going to be casting a shadow down on this wall, but the roof above the doors does not have an overhang, or what the amount of the overhang that it does have is so small that it's going to cast a very small drop shadow. Some more areas where we're seeing the forward-facing plane is actually right here on this sign in the front of the building, so let's go ahead and darken that forward-facing plane, and we'll give a little bit of a drop shadow there. We are looking at what I would consider the first passive shadow on this building, looking at how the light source is hitting the different planes, and this factor goes for both digital and traditional art, but you want to put your shadows wherever the light source can't reach, so that's just what we're doing here with this first pass. So if I take that off, if I lift that first pass, we're seeing the flat colors, or well, really the fill color. So here are the fill colors, because they're using a gradient. We can see here that we've already sort of hinted at a shadow up here closer to the top of the overhang than here towards the ground where we see more light, and that's because I am assuming there is bounce light coming up off of the ground back towards the building. So now when I turn on my first pass of shadows here, the reason why the gradient is different than the flat colors when I'm applying shadows is because I am still going to see that gradient underneath the shadows that I am applying to my multiply layer. It is creating an extra sense of dimension, so we're not seeing flat color throughout, which is especially useful on a very boxy building like this one. But I'm going to go ahead now and start a second pass to really break up even more of these shapes, particularly since so many of the forward-facing planes are looking kind of flat still, and I want to make those pop a lot more. So I'm going to definitely add in some extra drop shadows on this. And just looking at that very quickly, we can now see how our second pass of shadow has broken up some of these very flat planes into more distinct and defined shapes. We're also getting some contouring with the windows and the door. So these drop shadows have given us some depth in the windows where you would see the window pane based on the angle that we're looking at this building from. We're also getting drop shadow from the peaks of the roof as well, because that is a little bit more of an embezzled shape, and so it's going to have the slightest drop shadow. So despite this not being the most exciting building that I could have drawn, now that we've added some shading to it, this building went from this to this, which now gives us a lot more form and shape and makes the building seem a little bit more dimensional than what we had before. Now let's go in here and add some color dodge, and we will go from the shaded building to, and just to demonstrate what a huge part the shading actually contributes to this finished drawing, I'm going to go ahead and turn it off just that layer and leave the highlights on. And right there you can already tell how big of a difference that made, even with the gradients included in the fill colors. We are still looking at a pretty flat looking image, so those shadows that we worked on today in this video makes such a huge impact and will help your drawings in the future. If you liked this video and got value out of it, please hit the thumbs up to let me know that you liked it, and if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button to get even more tips, tricks, and tutorials. And I'll see you next time.